Hey guys, tonight we begin why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval dungeon. Forget everything Hollywood told you. This is the real story, and trust me, you probably wouldn't last a day. So before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from now. Dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, and let's jump in. You wake up in the dark, and before you even sit up, you realize that dark does not mean quiet. It means dripping water. It means the scratching of something with too many legs in the corner. It means groaning from the cell next to you, where someone has been trying to die for the last 3 days and failing spectacularly. The air is not air. It is damp, sponge air that sticks to your lungs and makes every breath taste like rust and rot and maybe despair. And before you ask, yes, that smell is real. No one here has bathed since last summer, and you are in a stone room designed with all the comfort of a coffin but less ventilation. Forget the movie scenes where dungeons look like candlelit corridors with clean shackles and dramatic lighting. This is more like an underground outhouse built by someone who hated architecture and hated you specifically. The straw on the ground is not straw. It is last year's failed harvest, combined with lice, fleas, and the occasional rat family who probably resent you for moving in uninvited. You shift your legs and something crunches beneath you, and it is either a chicken bone from the guard's dinner or a finger bone from whoever slept here before you, and neither answer is particularly encouraging. You might think, oh, I'll just lean against the wall and get comfortable, but the wall is slimy with moss and centuries of human misery, so congratulations, you have just given yourself medieval pneumonia. Modern people complain about back pain from their office chairs. You would trade your kingdom for one of those ergonomic mesh nightmares right now, and you would sit in it happily while humming thank you. Capitalism, meanwhile, the guard above is enjoying his bread, soaked in beer, while you are practicing the ancient art of chewing on nothing, which ironically burns calories. You cannot afford to lose. You hear a bucket scrape along the stone floor outside, and you think, finally water. But no, this is the bathroom system, and by bathroom system, I mean a bucket that gets full fast and gets emptied less often than you want to think about. So yes, welcome to medieval sanitation, the deluxe edition. You might imagine you could just tough it out one day in here. After all, you have survived crowded subways and poorly ventilated gyms, but trust me, subway, sweat, and gym socks are Chanel No. 5. Compared to the fragrance of moldy bread, vomit, rat droppings, and unwashed humanity, all compressed into a stone cellar that was built to make you regret existing before. You ask, can you at least get some fresh air? The answer is yes, if you call the occasional gust of wind sneaking through the barred window fresh, except it brings with it the aroma of the moat above where dead fish, sewage, and maybe a casual corpse take a leisurely swim. The guard strolls by rattling his keys, and you want to ask for mercy or maybe an extra blanket, but then you remember that blanket means an old wool rag crawling with mites and smelling like goat divorce, so maybe you will just curl into your own arms and pretend you are somewhere else, which by the way is the official pastime of dungeon prisoners. The first hour passes slower than dial-up internet, and you realize that time is meaningless down here. The sun does not reach you. The bells of the church above are muffled, and the only clock you have is the drip, drip, drip of the ceiling leak, which is a medieval equivalent of a metronome designed to drive you insane. So yes, congratulations, you are 1 hour into your medieval dungeon experience, and already regretting every life choice that led you here. By the time the second hour drags its damp feet across your soul, you start to notice the soundtrack of dungeon life, which is less dramatic chanting monks and more a collection of noises that make you want to donate your ears to science. There is the endless drip from above, the clank of iron as some poor soul down the hall thrashes in his chains. The muffled laughter of guards who find your misery more entertaining than a tournament, and the occasional scream that reminds you this building is not a hotel, it is an appetizer course for hell. You might think you can tune it out the way you ignore your neighbor's karaoke night, but no, here every sound feels personal, every sound demands attention, and every sound is a reminder that you are trapped like a chicken in a barrel, except chickens get better ventilation. You shift your body again, trying to find the least painful position on the floor, which is basically medieval yoga, but without mats. Instructors or Instagram likes the straw stabs your skin with tiny betrayals, and the stone beneath feels like lying on frozen bread. And speaking of bread, you can hear the guards eating theirs upstairs, thick loaves with cheese, while you lick your lips and dream of crumbs so stale they could break a tooth, if you are lucky, and I mean medieval lucky, which means not dying immediately. You might get a piece of bread tossed into your cell later, but it will be moldy, damp, and chewed by rats first. And you will eat it anyway, with the same enthusiasm as a modern person discovering free Wi-Fi. Your stomach growls and echoes against the walls like a sad medieval drum solo, and you begin to wonder if hunger itself is the dungeon master here. The thirst comes next. Your mouth feels dry as parchment, and your tongue tastes like it has been salted by demons. You consider sipping from the puddle near the wall, but the puddle is less water and more community project of bacteria, fungi, and despair. So yes, you will drink it eventually, but for now you hesitate. The cellmates around you whisper, groan, or cough in the dark, and their coughs are not delicate. Victorian coughs, these are full-body medieval tuberculosis concerts with mucus, percussion, and lung solos, and the best part is, you cannot leave. You think maybe you will just meditate. Maybe focus on your breathing, but meditation works better when the air does not taste like fermented armpit, and the smell of 10 centuries of urine is not seeping into your soul. The guard comes again, dragging his boots across the stones with the casual authority of someone who knows you are powerless, and he slams his staff against the bars just to remind you that you are less important than his leftover soup. You think about asking for mercy, but then you remember mercy in the medieval dictionary usually comes spelled as execution. So you close your mouth and keep pretending that this is a temporary Airbnb rental. The hours stretch until they feel like centuries, and already your skin itches, your joints ache, and your stomach feels like it has filed for bankruptcy. This is not glamorous suffering, it is slow, boring suffering, the kind that makes you long for even the dullest chores outside, laundry, goat herding, anything but sitting in the darkness with your regrets and a bucket that smells worse than your ex's apartment hallway. After 3 hours, you are beginning to realize that you would not last a day in a medieval dungeon, because you can barely last until lunch. By the 4th hour, the novelty of your misery has already worn off, and now the reality sets in. That this place is designed not for punishment alone, but for slow, grinding erosion of body and soul. The stones sweat with dampness that seeps into your clothes, into your bones, and into your imagination. Until you swear you can hear the walls whispering, and you think maybe this is how madness begins, with damp socks and silence too thick to breathe. You scratch at your skin, because the straw bedding has given you an instant family of fleas who are throwing a banquet in your honor, and the menu is you, and you slap at them, but it makes no difference, because they have been dining on human misery since the Crusades, and are not intimidated by your flailing arms. You try to distract yourself by pacing, but pacing in a medieval dungeon is like running a marathon in a broom closet. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, and then you crash into the wall, because there is no space for dignity here. Your head bumps the stone, and you wonder how many others before you have left their skull marks. Here, a gallery of despair, carved by accident and boredom. You look at the bars of your cell, and you think about escape, but the iron is thick, the lock is smug, and the guard outside is armed with boredom and a stick, and frankly, he would love the excuse to use it on you, so instead you sit again on the slime floor and feel your stomach complain. Louder than the distant moans echoing from the next corridor, hunger becomes a second guard. It patrols your insides with claws, and you wonder what would be worse, starvation or the moment when they finally bring food, because that food is going to be soup, if you can call it that soup, that is mostly water with a memory of cabbage floating like a ghost, and maybe a chunk of mystery meat. If the rats were generous enough to leave any behind, imagine broth flavored with disappointment served lukewarm in a wooden bowl that has been washed less often than your cell, and congratulations, you have just dined at the Dungeon Cafe. This is not the hearty medieval feast of turkey legs and mead that television promised. No, this is diet cuisine. For those who did not sign up for it, the sound of someone slurping next door makes you salivate and hate them simultaneously. And you realize that in this place, jealousy is not over gold or land, but over who got the slightly thicker spoonful of gruel. Meanwhile, the smell of the latrine bucket becomes stronger than the smell of food, which is saying something, because the bucket is closer and more reliable than dinner time, and when you try to breathe through your mouth, the taste does not improve, it only changes flavor from moldy straw to sour despair. The fifth hour drags in with the subtle grace of a drunken donkey, and you are beginning to hallucinate daylight, even though daylight is a privilege reserved for those who are not buried beneath stone. You think about the outside world, about grass under your feet, and the way the wind used to sting your face in winter. And you would give anything for that sting now, because this air is not wind, it is just wet suffocation. Your eyes adjust to the gloom, and you notice carvings in the stone scratches from past prisoners. Names, tally marks, prayers, curses, and one particularly artistic drawing of what looks like a chicken wearing a crown, because when you have nothing else, you leave graffiti for the next miserable tenant to admire. You run your fingers along the grooves and feel connected to the anonymous parade of failures who sat here before you, each thinking maybe they would last a day, and each proving they could not. You chuckle dryly, which is a mistake, because laughing in this dungeon echoes like madness, and now the coughing prisoner beside you thinks you have finally snapped, and honestly maybe you have, by the time the night rolls in, if you can even call it night, because down here time is an illusion crafted by dripping water and the occasional scream. You realize that surviving a full day in this dungeon is not about strength or courage. It is about surrendering your dignity piece by piece. The cold creeps in with the arrogance of a tax collector, and it settles in your joints, until every movement feels like your bones have been replaced with wet wood. You curl into yourself, trying to generate warmth, but your body heat is leaking away faster than the hope in your mind. The straw beneath you offers no comfort, only prickles and lice, and the stones above you drip with icy contempt. You can hear the guards upstairs laughing at some joke you will never hear, and the sound is a reminder that their world is beer and meat and light, while yours is filth and darkness and regret. Your stomach clenches with hunger again, and when the guard finally tosses a crust of bread into your cell, you leap for it like a starving dog, only to discover it is so stale you could build a fortress wall with it, and you gnaw on it anyway, because your options are chew or starve, and starvation feels less appealing with every gurgle of your empty gut. You think about water, and then remember the bucket, and you stare at that puddle in the corner again, wondering how much disease one sip would buy you, and then you realize you are calculating risk like a medieval accountant, balancing the ledger of misery. Congratulations, you are now bargaining with filth. The coughing man next door grows quieter, and you wonder if that is good news or bad, and then the silence tells He has just graduated from the dungeon curriculum to the graveyard syllabus, and you cannot decide whether to envy him or pity him. You lie back against the wall again, slimy moss against your hair, and you wonder if this is what eternity feels like, damp and endless and stupidly boring. You think about home, about beds that squeak and blankets that itch and food that was bland but at least edible, and you laugh to yourself because you once complained about the monotony of daily bread, soup and chores, and now you would give your teeth for a loaf of that bread. You scratch again and realize the fleas are winning this war. They have claimed you as new territory, and there is no surrender in their constitution. You swat and scratch, but it only makes them hungrier, and you wonder if they are laughing in tiny flea voices about how soft modern skin tastes. The 6th hour of your stay in this pit of despair bleeds into the 7th, and you wonder if the guards even know or care what time it is, or if they simply enjoy the timelessness of your misery. You cannot tell if it is night or day, if the sun has risen or set, and honestly, it no longer matters, because the dungeon has swallowed time whole and replaced it with an eternity of discomfort. Dripping ceilings, moldy walls, rats whispering in the corners, and the constant unshakable feeling that you are decomposing while still alive by the time you drag yourself into what must now be the 7th or 8th hour, though it could just as easily be the 2nd or the 22nd, because time has lost all meaning in this dripping tomb. You realize that the dungeon has begun to play tricks on your mind, and you wonder if this is deliberate, because what better torture than letting the victim argue with their own sanity? You hear footsteps above your head, but then you are not sure if it is footsteps or just the rats holding their own midnight parade, and you chuckle to yourself, which echoes in the stone chamber like the laugh of a lunatic, and maybe that is exactly what you are becoming. Your stomach twists again as hunger turns from an ache to a gnawing creature that crawls through your ribs and scratches from the inside. You glance at the puddle in the corner, the stagnant swamp of disease and filth, and you try to convince yourself it is water, but your nose argues otherwise. Still, your throat burns and your lips crack, and you wonder how many sips it would take before your body stops caring, and then you remind yourself that thirst kills faster than hunger, and suddenly the puddle looks friendlier than it did an hour ago. The guard strolls by once more, rattling his keys like a smug musician, and you cannot help thinking he takes pleasure in your twitching body pressed against the slime wall. And why should he not? He has beer and meat upstairs, while you sit counting drips like a monk who has lost his prayers. You try to lie down, but the straw pricks your back, the stone freezes your skin, and the fleas march like tiny soldiers across your legs, feeding with the determination of a crusade. You swat and scratch until you are panting, but they always return, more relentless than any army, and you begin to understand why medieval chroniclers wrote about demons, because surely no ordinary insect could be this persistent. Another prisoner moans in the darkness, and the sound crawls up your spine like an icy centipede. You want to tell them to shut up, but then you realize they might already be dead, and you are listening to the last air leaving their lungs, so you stay silent and wrap your arms around your knees, rocking slightly, not because it helps, but because it gives the illusion of rhythm, and rhythm feels like control. The dungeon teaches you quickly that you own nothing. Not your comfort, not your time, not even your body, because everything is gnawed, stolen, borrowed by fleas, rats, and the air itself. You remember how you once complained about your office job, how the chairs squeaked, how the coffee was bitter, how the air conditioning blasted too cold. Now you would sell your soul for that squeaky chair, that bitter coffee, that recycled air. Because at least it was air that did not taste like armpit stew and despair. You think of the outside world of sunlight, brushing across your face, and you imagine fields of grass bending in the wind, and the very idea makes you want to cry, but you do not cry because tears would only attract more fleas. Stretch longer and longer until you feel your bones sink into the floor itself, as if you are merging with the dungeon, and you know this was part of the design. Not just to cage you, but to make you forget that life exists elsewhere. Your mind drifts to food again because hunger is a bully that will not let you think of anything else. You imagine roasted chicken, crisp skin juices dripping into the fire, and the image is so vivid. You can almost smell it, but the only smell that greets you is the bucket in the corner, and it slams into your senses. Like a slap, you cough and gag and curse silently. And then you laugh, because who are you cursing? The guards, the bucket, the fleas? No. You curse yourself for being here, for thinking even for 1 second that you could survive this like some heroic movie character. The truth is, those heroes would last about as long as you, maybe less, because even they would not eat the soup. The guards bring, finally, a guard appears, carrying a pot, and the prisoners stir with weak hope. He ladles out the gruel into bowls, cracked, filthy bowls that might once have been wood, but now are just crusted artifacts of misery. When your turn comes, you snatch the bowl and stare into its depths, where cloudy water holds floating mysteries. A shred of cabbage, a sliver of onion, and something that might have once belonged to an animal, or maybe just a shadow. You swallow anyway, because hunger is louder than dignity, and the taste is what you imagine sadness would taste like. If it could be boiled, you gulp it down, every drop, and lick the rim, and feel no shame, because there is no shame left in this place, only subliver. Guards laugh at you as you devour the liquid, as if they know the trick of the dungeon is not the chains or the walls, but the way it strips you down layer by layer, until you are no longer you, but just a hollow shell, shaped like a person. They toss a chunk of bread afterward, hard enough to crack a tooth, and you chew it anyway, gnawing like a desperate dog, and the crumbs fall onto the straw where rats rush to snatch them, and for a moment you fight the rats for crumbs and lose, because they are faster and hungrier, and suddenly you are negotiating territory with vermin, and losing the battle entirely. You slump back against the wall and feel the bread scrape down your throat, and you realize you are still starving, but now bloated with air and disappointment. You wonder if this was intentional, to feed just enough to keep you alive, and just little enough to keep you suffering. Yes, that feels about right, because if they wanted you dead, they could do it quickly, but the dungeon is not about death. It is about stretching life into something so unbearable that death feels like mercy. The hours crawl on, and your thoughts grow fuzzy, like wool unraveling from an old cloak. You remember scraps of your life outside, but they feel like dreams, voices of family, laughter, of friends. The smell of bread baking in a clean oven you hold. Those memories close because you know the dungeon is trying to erase them with every drip, and every cough you hum softly to yourself, a tune you cannot even name, and for a moment it almost feels like you exist outside these walls until the guard slams his staff against the bars, and the sound ricochets through your skull like thunder. You flinch, and the tune dies, and you remember where you are. You remember that even your thoughts are not safe here. Time bends further, you try to sleep, but the cold is a knife, the fleas are daggers, and the noises are drums. You drift for seconds, only to wake with a start, as though the dungeon itself refuses to let you escape into dreams. Your head aches, your eyes burn, and you realize this place is not built to kill the body quickly, it is built to murder the spirit. Slowly, one humiliating bite at a time, your ribs ache from curling too tightly, your knees throb from stone pressing too long against bone, and still the minutes drip by, slower than molasses in winter. You try to imagine lasting a day, but the truth is a day here is an eternity, and eternity is not survivable, not By you, not by anyone, not really. Your body is no longer your own, not really, because the dungeon has claimed it in subtle ways. The walls are chewing at your skin with dampness, the stone biting through every joint until you are not sure whether the ache belongs to you or to the prison itself. And time, if it can still be called that, doesn't move like it should. It doesn't tick or flow or pass. It drips, thick and ugly, the way candle wax melts unevenly down iron sconces. Each drop adds another layer of weight onto your chest, pressing you deeper into the role of prisoner, whether you like it or not. And you do not. You've already lost track of how long you've been here. Maybe hours, maybe days. But your mind, desperate for anchor points, begins to hallucinate rhythms that don't exist. The sound of a footstep in the corridor, a faint jingling of keys, a cough echoing down from above. Sometimes, when exhaustion crushes you into a fitful half-sleep, you swear you hear voices, not of your fellow prisoners, not even of guards, but whispers crawling through the cracks in the stone. They call your name or laugh in cruel familiarity, until you jolt awake and realize there is only the dark and the drip-drip of unseen water. Your stomach has become an enemy, growling so loudly it might as well be confessing secrets to the jailer. Hunger strips away dignity faster than chains ever could. You find yourself eyeing the straw in the corner, wondering if chewing on it might trick your mouth into believing you're eating. It doesn't. The straw is damp and tastes of rot, like gnawed bark mixed with mold. It scratches your throat and makes you cough so hard that for a moment you fear you'll vomit. Except there's nothing left to vomit. But worse than hunger is thirst. Your tongue feels like it has been traded out for a strip of leather, cracked and useless. You think of water the way a miser thinks of gold. The drip of moisture somewhere down the corridor becomes a tormenting melody, proof that fresh liquid exists, but remains forever out of reach. And when at last the guard does arrive, tossing in a bucket half filled with something vaguely wet, you dive for it without hesitation. The water is not clear. It's not even water in the way your memory promises. It's a muddy slurry with things floating in it, but it hits your throat like salvation. You gulp until the bucket is empty, uncaring of the grit sliding between your teeth. Survival has a way of erasing standards, and yet even survival is not guaranteed here. You've seen no, you've smelled the evidence. The stench of bodies that no longer breathe lingers in the corners. Sometimes, in the quiet, you hear the subtle movement of rats feeding on something that used to be human, and the guards. They do not rush to clean up. Death is as normal here as breathing, maybe even more so. A corpse is only another layer of the dungeon's permanent population. Your mind, desperate to protect itself, begins playing cruel tricks. You start talking to shadows, whispering bargains into the damp air. Sometimes you even imagine you're back outside, walking through a market, hearing the chatter of merchants, the clatter of hooves, the laughter of children. But it is only memory trying to soothe you, and when reality returns, it is sharper than before. Because nothing in this place lets you forget for long. The walls sweat with moisture. Chains scrape when you shift. Your own skin begins to itch. From filth, crawling with lice and fleas that thrive in the dark. You scratch until your nails tear skin, until little lines of blood trickle down your arms, and even then the crawling sensation does not leave. Cleanliness is no longer a concept. Dirt has fused with your body until you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. And then, of course, there is the jailer. Not a man of compassion or cruelty, but something worse, a man of indifference. He arrives when he pleases, delivers what scraps he chooses, and looks at you as if you are already a corpse. His eyes do not judge. They simply regard you as one more piece of inventory, no different from the rats, no more important than the straw. In some ways, you wish he would hate you. Hatred, at least, would mean you exist. His indifference erases you. Night and day have ceased to matter. Down here, the sun is a myth, the moon a forgotten tale. The only cycles are those of your own body, when it screams for food, when it gives in to sleep, when it jolts awake in terror. And terror, truly, is the dungeon's favorite trick, not the sudden kind, not the jump of a blade or the crack of thunder, but the slow kind that eats away at you grain by grain. Terror that lives in the silence when you wonder whether the next sound will be the guard or the executioner, whether the next bucket of water will come, or whether thirst will end you first. And yet, perhaps the cruelest thing about a medieval dungeon is not the pain, not the hunger, not the filth, but the realization that survival is meaningless. Even if you endure the rats, the sores, the sleepless nights, even if you manage to outlast the cough that rattles your lungs or the fevers that burn your body, what then? You are not here to be rescued. You are here because someone wanted you gone, silenced, forgotten. A pardon will not come. Freedom is not waiting at the end of the tunnel. There is only waiting, and then there is only death. Your ribs ache, your knees throb, your mind frays, and as the hours stretch into what might be another eternity, you understand why no one lasts a day in a medieval dungeon. Because it is not a place measured in days. It is a place that devours time, identity, hope, until you are nothing more than another whisper in the dark, another shadow on the wall, another body for the rats to find. And so the final truth of the dungeon is this: you would not last, not for a day, not for an hour, more than your body can betray you. No one ever did. No one ever will. The silence that follows that truth is heavier than chains. It hangs in the air like damp fog, clinging to your lungs, seeping into your bones. You might have thought that silence would bring relief, that an end to the screams and the dripping water would feel like mercy, but it doesn't. It presses against your skull until you begin to hear things that aren't there. A scrape, a breath, the faint sound of footsteps echoing where none should be. You begin to wonder if the dungeon itself is alive, if the walls are listening, if the stones themselves are feeding off your weakness. That's the trick of a dungeon. Its cruelty isn't just physical, it's mental. The space was designed not simply to cage you, but to unravel you thread by thread, until you aren't even sure you exist outside its shadows. Your sense of time, already shattered, dissolves completely. The last tether you had was the drip of water, but even that betrays you. Sometimes it falls faster, sometimes slower. You count the drops in desperation, but the numbers stretch into nonsense. Was it 20 or 200? Did you blink and lose an hour, or has it been a single second? The dungeon does not care. It is patient. It has consumed better men than you, and it will consume better still long after you are gone. You shift your body to ease the pain in your ribs, but that only ignites another pain. Your ankles, swollen and raw where iron bites into flesh. You wonder how much of your body is still yours. The sores, the bruises, the hunger pangs that gnaw like animals, these things no longer feel connected to you. They belong to the dungeon now. The dungeon collects them, catalogues them, owns them. You are only the vessel through which it feeds. Somewhere in the dark, you hear movement, the scrape of leather on stone, a cough muffled behind a door. You tense, though your muscles ache too much for real readiness. Is it the guard, the torturer? Or worse, another prisoner? Because prisoners are not companions here. They are rivals for breath, for water, for the small illusions of hope. You have heard stories, prisoners, left together in the same pit, turning against one another like wolves. Not because they were evil, but because the dungeon makes you that way. It convinces you that survival requires betrayal, that the other's pain is your meal, that their weakness is your strength. It does not even take long. But this time, it isn't a prisoner, it's the guard. You know him by the sound of the key scraping iron. You know him by the deliberate pace, each step echoing like judgment. You have not seen his face clearly, only glimpses in torchlight. And even those glimpses blur in your memory. But you know his smell, the mixture of sweat, smoke, and something sour that clings to his clothes. When he enters, the air itself seems to recoil. The torch he carries throws a weak, sputtering light that makes the shadows seem deeper. He doesn't look at you at first. That's part of the ritual. He surveys the walls, the bucket, the floor, as though the cell is more important than you. You are an afterthought, an object, not a person. When he finally does look, his gaze is not human, it is the cold inspection one gives to livestock, or to a tool that is beginning to rust. You want to speak, but your throat is too raw, too dry. The dungeon has stolen even your voice. He doesn't need to hear it anyway. He knows, they all know. A prisoner's words in here are meaningless. Just air wasted on ears that long ago stopped listening. He leaves something behind this time. A bowl. You stare at it with the hunger of a wolf, but caution keeps you still, because dungeon food is not food, not really. It is gruel so thin it could drown a fly. It is bread so hard it cracks teeth. Sometimes, if they are feeling generous, a strip of meat so rancid it makes you gag before you swallow. But you will eat. You will always eat, because hunger is worse than taste. And the dungeon knows that too. You drag the bowl toward you, trembling, fingers clinking against the stone. The smell hits you first, sour fermented, like something rotting. Your stomach turns, but the pain inside forces your hand. You sip, it burns. It always burns. You close your eyes and swallow, feeling it slide like slime down your throat. You tell yourself it is enough. You tell yourself you can last another hour, maybe two. But deep down, you know the truth. Food here is not nourishment. It is prolonging the inevitable. It is giving the dungeon more time to play with you. The guard lingers longer than usual. His eyes study you, his lips curled in something between boredom and contempt. You wonder what he sees. Does he see a man, a body, or only a shell that has not yet collapsed? You wonder if he knows your name, or if you are only the one in the far cell. Names have no meaning here. The dungeon erases them faster than hunger erases dignity. When he finally leaves, the silence returns. But it is not the same silence. It is heavier, as though the torchlight carried away something more than fire. You clutch the bowl, empty now, and stare into the darkness that seems to move even when you are still. You imagine shapes in the stone, faces, fingers, sometimes. You think you see them move. Sometimes you are certain they do. This is the madness they spoke of. The madness that crawls into your skull when the walls are too close, when the dark is too deep, when the hunger is too sharp. You laugh once, a weak sound that echoes wrong. The dungeon eats that too. It eats laughter, joy, memory. All that is left is the endless waiting, and yet still you cling. Not to hope, because hope is poison here, but to sheer animal stubbornness. The same stubbornness that keeps rats gnawing scraps in the corner. The same stubbornness that keeps weeds forcing through cracks in stone. You will not last, but you will resist the dungeon's satisfaction for another breath, another drip of water, another echo in the dark. Because in the dungeon, resistance is the only rebellion left. The silence of the dungeon doesn't mean peace. It means you've grown so used to the dripping, the squeaking, the shuffle of vermin feet, that when all of it dies away for a heartbeat, it feels louder than a scream. Your skin prickles. You wait for the return of the drip, but instead comes the heavy scrape of metal the door. A sliver of light cuts into the dark like a blade, making your eyes wince, even though it's only a guttering torch. The jailer lumbers back, keys rattling against his side. He doesn't look at you, not really. To him, you're no more alive than the bucket in the corner. He mutters something under his breath, a word you can't quite catch, then slides a small bowl into the cell. The sound it makes when it hits the stone is enough to set your teeth on edge. You crawl toward it, not because hunger makes you strong, but because it makes you stupid, desperate enough to risk whatever's in there. It could be broth, it could be mold, it could be water so filthy you'll get sick by morning. Doesn't matter. Your hands shake as you dip your fingers in and bring it to your lips. It's a thin gruel, lukewarm, with the texture of ground barley and grit. It sticks in your throat, but you force it down anyway. The human body clings to anything that promises survival, no matter how much dignity it costs. The jailer's eyes flicker to you once quick, dismissive, almost bored. You think you see a smirk, but maybe that's just the shadows playing tricks. He turns, boots crunching on the grit, and the door groans shut again. The light vanishes, and you are left with the after-image burned on your retinas. You close your eyes, trying to cling to that faint shape of torchlight, as if it was sunlight. It fades quickly, leaving only darkness again. Hours or was it minutes? Drag by, your stomach growls, even though you've just eaten. Hunger is cruel that way. It doesn't care that you've fed it scraps. It keeps gnawing, and beneath it, thirst scrapes harder. That bowl wasn't water. Your tongue feels like old leather, cracked and dry. You lean back against the wall, bones pressing against the cold stone, and wonder if this is how people go mad. They say some did, prisoners who clawed their own arms open just to taste blood. Others who babbled until they choked on their own tongues. Madness doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It seeps, like damp, like mold, filling every crack of your mind until you don't notice how rotten it's become. You feel it creeping already. In the way you count the stones in the wall for the 100th time, convinced one might have shifted when you weren't looking. Another scrape at the door. This time, it isn't the jailer. The steps are lighter, quicker, with a faint nervous rhythm. When the hatch at the bottom creaks open, you glimpse a pale face, sun-thin eyes, darting like a rabbit's. An apprentice, a servant, he whispers. Something too soft to catch, then shoves another bowl inside, this one sloshing with liquid. Water, maybe, or something worse. He doesn't wait to see if you drink. He closes the hatch so fast, his fingers almost get caught. You lunge at the bowl, nearly spilling it, and gulp it down. The taste is metallic, like iron. Maybe the bucket it came from was rusting. Doesn't matter. It cools your throat enough to make you sigh, though the ache in your belly only sharpens. You sit in the dark again, rocking slightly. Your body is still alive, and that's almost worse. Because every nerve continues to scream its grievances to cold. Too hungry, too cramped. Time melts. At some point, you realize you've been whispering to yourself. Just nonsense, syllables without meaning, like a child humming in the dark. It startles you when you notice. Your own voice sounds alien, too loud, too strange, bouncing back from the damp walls like someone mocking you. You clamp your mouth shut, but a laugh bubbles up anyway, dry and cracked. This is how eternity works in the dungeon. It doesn't kill you quickly. It lets you collapse slowly, thought by thought, until you're no longer sure where you end and the stone begins. Maybe you'll become part of the wall. Maybe you already are. You curl tighter, bones protesting, heart hammering in uneven beats, and then the bell. Distant, muffled, but unmistakable. A church bell, tolling somewhere above the ground, its sound sinking faintly through layers of earth and stone. For a heartbeat, you stop breathing. That bell means time exists outside. It means morning, or evening, or something that still moves. While you are trapped in stillness, you cry without realizing it, the tears hot on your cold skin. Not because the bell brings hope, but because it reminds you that hope is impossible. Your mind drifts. You think of the sky. Blue, endless, impossible now. You think of grass bending under the wind, of bread baking in an oven, of laughter you'll never hear again. Memory is crueler than the dungeon. It feeds you feasts when your body starves. It taunts you with warmth when your fingers are ice. You whisper names, maybe yours, maybe others. The dungeon swallows them, keeps them for itself. Sleep finally takes you, a fitful, shivering thing. When you wake, you don't know if it's been minutes or days. Your back screams, your limbs ache. The bowl is gone. Did you drink it? Did someone take it? The line between what happens and what you dream blurs. Maybe the apprentice boy wasn't real. Maybe the jailer isn't either. Maybe you've been alone all along. Another scrape, another torch. The jailer again, or maybe someone else. Shapes blur in the light. He says something you can't understand. A laugh follows, deep and cruel. The door stays open longer this time. Long enough for the air from the corridor to brush your face. It smells of smoke and tallow. For a moment, you imagine what it would be to crawl toward it, to fling yourself at that faint hint of air, even if it meant a beating. Your legs twitch, but you don't move. Some instinct whispers, conserve, survive, but survive for what? He leaves, the door shuts, and the silence presses again. You lie there, listening to your own heartbeat thudding like a drum, trying to decide if it's a mercy or a curse that it hasn't stopped yet. Your eyes burn from the darkness, not because there is light, but because your brain invents flashes, specks, ghostly shapes to remind you it still exists. Every blink is a hallucination, sparks that aren't there, outlines of faces that never were, shadows moving in a void that has no direction. Your stomach cramps, again hunger's slow fist curling in your gut. The bread you once gagged on is now only a memory, one you would crawl across nails to taste again. But no crawling, not now. Your limbs weigh more than lead, and the cold floor has claimed you as one of its own. The rats make another pass, snouts pushing against your ankle as if testing whether you've finally surrendered to stillness. They scurry away when you twitch, but you know they'll be back. They always come back. The air thickens, clotted with the stink of your own sweat, mixed with the iron Thames of rusting chains and the sour rot of waste. You breathe shallow, as though taking in less might save you from suffocating. But the dungeon doesn't care. It squeezes everything, the air, the time, your thoughts, especially your thoughts. They fray at the edges, unraveling into nonsense. And you begin to wonder whether you're even you anymore, or just another nameless groan echoing along these dripping walls. Somewhere above, you imagine people walking on cobblestones, buying bread, arguing about prices. Life goes on above your tomb, and you are already forgotten. Sleep claws at you, cruel in its false kindness. Each time your head dips forward, you jolt awake, certain that if you let go, you won't wake up again. But maybe that would be mercy. The dungeon forces you into a loop. Hunger, cold, thirst, pain, rats, darkness, over and over until you can't tell which came first or which matters anymore. Your ribs ache when you breathe too deeply. Your throat burns from swallowing nothing but stale spit. Even the stone pressing into your back has taken on a rhythm of torment, as if it's been shaped to grind you down inch by inch. And then there's sound, or the lack of it. The silence is never truly silent. The water drips, the chains creak, your heartbeat roars in your skull until you're sure it'll split. But it's the faint echoes that ruin you most. Whispers, screams, coughs from cells you'll never see. Companions, or just the dungeon mocking you with its own cruel ventriloquism. You don't know, and you don't dare call out. Voice wasted is breath wasted. So you stay silent too, joining the choir of ghosts that will never be heard. At some point it could be minutes or centuries your mind slips sideways. The dungeon feels smaller, then impossibly large, then as if it's inside you rather than around you. You wonder if you've stood up, but your body hasn't moved. You wonder if you're dead, but the pain argues otherwise. And pain is the only truth left. The rats agree. They creep back, braver this time, one paw testing your thigh, then retreating as your muscles twitch involuntarily. You can't help but laugh, though it comes out as a broken wheeze. Here you are, a banquet waiting to be served, and all it takes is a few more hours or less for them to start the feast in earnest. You remember things now. Uninvited, cruel gifts from your mind. Sunlight stabbing your eyes, laughter ringing in a courtyard, the feel of warm bread breaking in your hands. These memories hurt worse than the stones, because they promise something you will never have again. Your throat tightens with a sob you can't spare moisture for, so it dies silent in your chest. The dungeon wins again. Every thought of the outside is just another lash, and you realize escape doesn't mean freedom anymore. Escape means death. Clean, merciful, unchained death. Time is no longer minutes or hours. It's just beats between cramps, between rat visits, between shivers. The chain doesn't rattle anymore because you don't pull against it. You've accepted the shackle as part of your body. The walls don't loom because you've stopped looking. You are not a prisoner, you are the dungeon now, or the dungeon is you. It makes no difference, because both are endless, both are forgotten, and both are doomed to rot in silence. And so the truth you already knew curls back to bite. You would not last. Not for a day, not for the eternity a day becomes here. The dungeon always wins, and it always will. The dungeon always wins, and it always will. And yet, the mind, in its stubborn cruelty, does not stop trying to bargain. You tell yourself that maybe if you sleep, you will lose the hours quicker. But there is no real sleep here, only a drifting half-state where rats scratch just out of sight, and the drip of water cuts through even the foggiest of dreams. Your body jerks awake every time you slip under, because the cold does not allow surrender. Your chest shivers with shallow breaths, and your own ribs jab against the stone with every movement, as though reminding you there is no comfort here. Not for you, not for anyone. The dungeon begins to feel less like a place and more like a second skin, stretched over you, clinging too close, cutting off the air. Its weight presses down, invisibly but insistently, the way guilt presses into the heart or grief gnaws at the gut. You are wearing the dungeon now, whether you like it or not. You try to peel it away by closing your eyes, but the smell follows. Mold, rot, damp, straw turned sour with urine, and something meatier, something metallic that seeps into your nose until you taste it at the back of your tongue. Hours, if they are hours, drag their nails across your mind. You lose the sense of before and after. The only measure of time is when the guards decide to rattle past, their boots loud, their laughter louder. Sometimes they stop outside a cell, not yours, and you hear the thud of a body dragged out, the muted screams carried up the stairwell like smoke curling out of a chimney. Sometimes the prisoner returns, whimpering, limping, eyes glazed in the dark. Sometimes the prisoner doesn't return at all. You try not to imagine what happens beyond your iron bars, but the dungeon makes imagination a weapon. Your thoughts become a torture device in themselves. They whisper, would you be flayed, burned, broken on a wheel? They whisper it over and over until the words dig into your ears like splinters. Your stomach twists itself into knots, not only from hunger, but from dread. Hunger gnaws, but dread devours. At first you begged for food, even scraps, but now you have learned silence. Silence is safer. A voice invites attention, and attention here is never kindness. Better to curl in on yourself, ribs tucked head down, as though invisibility could save you. But invisibility is a lie. The dungeon knows you. It breathes with you. It waits for your silence. Then it fills it with sounds you cannot explain. A scratching too high to be rats. A dripping too steady to be chance. Sometimes a sigh, low and wet, as though the walls themselves exhale. You tell yourself it is in your mind, and yet you are no longer sure where your mind ends and the dungeon begins. The damp begins to take your flesh. Your skin never dries. It grows slick, clammy, soft. Blisters bloom at your feet where your soles press into cold water. Between your fingers, sores. Along your thighs, rashes. Flesh rots quickly when it is never kissed by sun. And you think, maybe that is the dungeon's secret. It does not need swords or fire to kill you. It only needs patience. Your back protests with every shift. The stone digs deeper. You think of a better, simple bed, straw and wool and warmth, and it becomes a hallucination. Your mouth waters for it as though it were bread. The image of lying down without pain grows so real you reach for it, but your fingers find only the slime-slick wall. The disappointment hits as sharply as hunger, and then comes the smell, again worse now. A prisoner nearby, unseen, has not moved in some time. The scent thickens, sweet and putrid. Death has bloomed somewhere close. You want to turn away, but where is away? The dungeon traps not only your body but your senses. You cannot close your nose. You cannot shut your ears. You cannot block the taste of rot from your tongue, carried in by damp, clinging air. The dungeon reminds you again. No one lasts. Not for a day. Not for the eternity a day becomes. And though you know this truth, you cannot stop testing it. Cannot. Stop straining against the invisible thread of hope that maybe you are different. Maybe you will outlast the walls. The irony bites hardest here. The hope itself is a form of torture. Your eyes burn. Sleep will not come. The stone is no softer. The air no warmer. Your bones no stronger. And still the dungeon waits. And still it wins. And you, curled in shadow, understand at last that there is no bargaining with forever. And so forever presses its weight upon you. Heavier than chains, heavier than hunger, heavier than the silence that has become its own kind of scream. Because you realize that forever is not a number or a clock you can measure, but a drowning. An endless dragging downward where the breath never comes, the end never comes. And your body is left to rot while your mind scratches and claws to invent escape that never arrives. And the dungeon, stone and shadow and stale air feeds on that desperation, stretching moments until they become lifetimes, and lifetimes until they collapse back into moments. A cruel rhythm you cannot keep pace with, your ribs aching with every shallow breath, your knees trembling from strain, your back a single cord of fire where you leaned too long against the wall that has no give, no softness, no mercy, and still you sit, because what else is there to do, and still you breathe, though each breath feels like theft stolen from a place that has already marked you for suffocation. And the thought comes again, how long could anyone last here? Really, how long before the walls close, not because they move, but because your mind insists they must. Because you feel them pressing closer with each passing blink, closer with each echo of dripping water, closer with each shuffle of unseen vermin that have adapted better than you ever could. Rats that thrive on rot, insects that eat the mildew, tiny blind things that scuttle and breed and survive while you, with all your so-called human strength, crumble in hours, in minutes, maybe less. Because the dungeon has its own rules, and you are not written into them. You are only passing through, only meat to soften its air with decay, only bones to grind into dust that will mix with the mortar and fill cracks you cannot see. And this awareness digs deeper than hunger, deeper than thirst, because both hunger and thirst are still tied to life. And what you feel now is tied to death, to the unraveling of self that comes when you know the world has sealed itself off above you. That light and laughter and warmth are fantasies belonging to someone else, someone outside, someone free, and the knowledge is a worse torment than chains, because chains only bind your limbs while this binds your soul, leaving you to wonder if eternity is not fire or storm, but exactly this: stone, dark, silence, the endless ache of waiting for nothing, and when your stomach snarls like a feral beast you cannot feed. The noise is almost comforting, almost proof you are still a creature that belongs to life, until the pain turns sharp and the comfort turns cruel, and you curl tighter, smaller, wishing to vanish into yourself, into the cracks of your own ribs, into the shallow of your breath. But even vanishing is denied here, because you are forced to remain, forced to endure, forced to learn that endurance has no finish line. It simply stretches until you cannot anymore. And you imagine how many others have sat here in the same curl, eyes burning, hearts slowing, minds splintering. How many scratched the wall with fingernails until they broke off? How many chewed their lips raw? How many prayed to gods who never answered? How many whispered to themselves until language itself dissolved into groans? How many fought rats for a strip of moldy bread? How many begged their own captors for mercy, only to be laughed at, spit on, forgotten, And you realize you are not unique. You are not the first. You will not be the last. You are only another body marked for erasure, another shadow among shadows, another proof that the dungeon always wins, and still you hold on, not because you believe you will escape, not because you think morning will come with rescue, but because something inside you refuses to let the dungeon be the only voice, refuses to collapse, even when collapse is the only sane choice. So you endure, staring at the black that does not shift, the air that does not move, the stone that does not warm, each heartbeat a hammer reminding you that you remain. Even if remaining is nothing but pain stretched across hours that will not end, and yet the cruelest thing is not the pain, not the hunger, not even the silence, but the thought that above you, somewhere, life continues, bread is baked, fires lit, children laugh, rain falls on open fields, bells toll, lovers whisper, markets open, the world turns, and none of it will ever reach you, none of it knows you are here, none of it bends for your suffering, and you understand the isolation is worse than death, because death at least ends. While this stretches, lingers, demands, a forever you cannot break, and so your eyes burn. Your breath staggers, your body weakens, and still the dungeon waits, and still it wins, and still you do not die, because the truth is that not dying is its own punishment. Survival here is worse than ending. And you are learning what every soul before you learned, that the dungeon is not made of stone, it is made of time. And time is the cruelest cage of all. Forever is not a word anymore, it is a taste, metallic on your tongue, like blood mixed with damp stone, it is a texture against your skin. Like mold clinging and crawling, even when you scrape it off, it is the rhythm of the drip, drip, drip echoing inside your skull until you no longer know if the sound is water or your sanity leaking out in drops. And the more you sit inside it, the more you realize the dungeon has no mercy and no end, that even imagining the world outside has become dangerous because every vision of sunlight, of trees swaying, of a face not carved by torment, feels less like hope and more like a cruel prank whispered into your ears by memory. And so you stop summoning those pictures. You stop daring to think of escape, because every imagined breath of fresh air only makes the dungeon more suffocating. And you are too tired to suffer twice, once in the body and once in the mind, so you learn the only lesson left, which is to surrender thought, to let yourself hollow out like the skulls that once must have lain here, to accept that your body is a cage inside a cage, and the rusting chains around your wrists are not restraints, but reminders of the futility of movement. Because whether you struggle or whether you slump, the stone floor remains, the air remains, the dripping water remains, the stink of mold and urine remains, and you remain, diminished with every breath, counting not time but layers of yourself peeled away, until you wonder what will vanish first, your flesh or the part of you that once believed it mattered. And when that thought curls tight around you, you finally understand why the dungeon does not need executioners or blades or flames, because what it executes best is not the body but the idea of the self, reducing a person to an echo, a shadow, a stain in the cracks of stone, and in this way it always wins, turning forever into the cruelest torture. For it is not the eternity of life you endure, but the eternity of being stripped until nothing remains but the dungeon itself, and you are only one more ghost clinging to the walls. It is strange how silence begins to feel like a voice of its own, as though the dungeon has grown tired of tormenting you with dripping water, and now instead leans closer, pressing its weight into your ears until you swear you can hear stone breathing, the walls inhaling your fear and exhaling despair. And in that suffocating cycle, you realize that time has not stopped here, but instead has stretched so thin that it frays around the edges, one moment blurring into the next, until you could swear you had already lived this hour, this breath, this flicker of pain before, and maybe you had. Maybe you are caught in some eternal loop where the dungeon itself rewinds your agony so it can replay it endlessly, squeezing fresh torment from the same stale cloth, and you no longer know if your body shivers because it is cold or because the memory of cold has sunk so deep it shivers for you, and your hunger is no longer hunger but something deeper, a hollow so cavernous it feels as though your insides are collapsing inward, ribs folding into themselves like rotten wood, and when you curl against the stone you find no comfort, no warmth, only the knowledge that stone has outlasted countless others before you and will outlast you as well, and that perhaps your bones will one day grind into it so finely that no trace remains, just dust mingling with the damp mortar, indistinguishable from all the other forgotten lives buried in the walls. And yet still you remain awake, still you breathe, still you clutch at the slow decay of consciousness, too stubborn to let go and too broken to resist, and this paradox becomes the true cruelty. For you are forced to endure, not because you are strong, but because weakness itself lingers. Weakness clings like a disease, dragging out every hour, stretching every second into a blade pressed against your nerves, until even the thought of death feels like a gift too generous for the likes of you. And so you remain, suspended between wanting release and being denied it, listening to your heartbeat grow erratic, uneven, stuttering like a candle flame choking on its own wax. And perhaps the dungeon takes pleasure in this, though not in any human way, not in laughter or delight, but in the slow certainty that it has claimed another victim into its endless archive, that it will file you away among the rest of the nameless dead it has swallowed, and the dungeon needs no markers, no graves, for its stone is the monument, its silence the epitaph, and your suffering the only prayer it ever demands. And even now, as your thoughts grow sluggish, as your limbs, you are less person than shadow, less voice than silence, less body than dust already forming on the floor where you lie. And this thought should terrify you, but in truth, terror requires energy, requires spark, and the dungeon has bled that from you as well, until all you can do is yield, watching as your own existence dwindles like a candle stub guttering without air, flicker by flicker, weaker with each imagined breath, knowing the end is not far but also not mercifully near, that it will draw itself out the way it always does, as it has for countless others before you, the faceless and forgotten, who once thought they might last a day, who once believed they had something the dungeon had not seen before, and yet every one of them sank into the same silence, left nothing behind but bones that crumble when touched, stories that no one tells, and a warning that echoes only in the stones themselves. The dungeon always wins. It waits longer than flesh, longer than hope, longer than memory, and you, who thought perhaps you might endure, learn, as they did, that you were never different, that you too are only passing through, on your way to nothing. And so you lie, eyes too heavy to close, chest too weak to rise, whispering to yourself that perhaps tomorrow will end, perhaps tomorrow will free, though you know with a certainty sharper than any blade that there is no tomorrow here, only the endless weight of stone, only the endless grip of shadow, only the endless patience of a dungeon that has broken kings and beggars alike, and now breaks you, piece by piece, until not even the thought of lasting remains. The dungeon holds you still, though your body begs for motion, though your bones crave release, though your spirit claws against the silence with the desperation of something that once thought it knew what survival meant. And as the hours bend and stretch into the grotesque shape of endlessness, you realize that the absence of freedom is not only chains on flesh, but the collapse of every possibility that once gave breath meaning. And so you sit in the stale damp, your chest rising with effort, your throat closing with the thick taste of mold and iron. And you wonder if this is what dying truly is, not the violent end of a blade or the thunderous silence of a final breath, but the slow erasure of the self, until even your thoughts dragged like broken carts through mud, until your name, that fragile sound once spoken by loved ones, becomes nothing but a smear of memory against stone that does not care. And the walls press closer, though they have not moved, and the shadows lean heavier, though they have not shifted, and you feel yourself thinning into them, dissolving like salt into brine. And yet somehow you continue, somehow you breathe, though each inhalation is shallow, cracked, almost apologetic, as though your lungs know they should have surrendered by now. And what remains of your will gnaws on scraps of old imaginings, on flashes of light and laughter that no longer seem real, until even those feel foreign, as though they belonged to someone else, someone luckier, someone who never found themselves here. And the dungeon whispers the same promise it has always whispered, that you would not last, that no one ever does, that every life is only a candle, caught in the draught of eternity, flickering before it is inevitably smothered, and your mind, weakened but stubborn, argues with this voice, searches for loopholes, imagines that perhaps there is a way out, if only you endure a little longer. But the body rebels, the body crumbles, the body betrays, its aches, no longer sharp but dull, consuming, its pains no longer cries, but a monotonous drone that eats at what you are, and you clutch your knees tighter, press your head against stone colder than any comfort, and try to forget that you ever knew warmth, that you ever knew sunlight, that you ever thought of days in terms of beginnings and endings, instead of the monstrous single stretch of now that will not break, will not bend, will not end. And somewhere inside you, the final thread of resistance frays, the dungeon pulling at it like a cruel seamstress unraveling cloth, and you recognize that the true torture was never the chains, nor the rats, nor the hunger, but this, the realization that survival is not living, that endurance is not victory, that the dungeon does not need to kill you because it has already undone you, pared you down into something less than human, and in this final awareness you sit, not screaming, not fighting, not even hoping, simply existing in a place that erases existence, until even the act of knowing you would not last is itself too much to hold, and so you let go, not with defiance, not with surrender, but with nothing at all, because there is nothing left, only stone, only dark, only the truth that has always been here waiting. You would not last. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, because the dungeon always wins. And in the end, you are nothing but proof of that eternal truth. You would not last. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, because the dungeon always wins, and in the end you are nothing but proof of that eternal truth, and the walls know it, the chains know it, even the dripping water knows it as it ticks away like the steady gnawing of time itself, and your body, once tense, once stubborn, now begins to sag into the weight of that inevitability, your mind flickering like the guttering stub of a candle. Left too long in the dark, the wick eaten down, the wax spent, And you imagine what happens when the flame finally collapses into smoke, when breath no longer rasps in your chest, when your eyes roll up, not because of exhaustion, but because of final surrender, and the dungeon, indifferent and patient, will swallow you as it has swallowed countless others, leaving no trace but perhaps the faintest smear of your existence. And you picture yourself among them, those nameless bones sunk into the earth beneath the stones, layered one atop another until the dungeon itself has become a graveyard, not carved into crosses or coffins, but simply into silence, and the silence stretches, becoming a weight heavier than the iron bars, heavier than your hunger, heavier than the pain chewing at your knees and ribs, because silence carries with it the memory of every scream that once filled it, every plea, every broken breath, and still it endures, teaching you that you are not the first, and you will not be the last, and your imagination drifts, against your will, into those who came before, a faceless parade of prisoners, dragged through the same doors, bound with the same iron, cast into the same stone pit, and every one of them told themselves what you told yourself, that maybe they would endure, maybe they would break the pattern, maybe they would last, but none of them did, and now you feel their ghost hands pressing against your skin, their despair mingling with yours, until you are not one voice in the dungeon, but thousands, all repeating the same cracked hymn of futility, and the air is thick with it, pressing into your lungs until every breath is borrowed from those who already lost. And still you hold on because holding on is all the body knows. Even when the mind begs to let go, even when your very soul whispers that it would be easier to stop, to sink, to disappear into the stone. But easier is not given here. Not in this place where time itself has been sharpened into a blade and drags it across you again and again. Each moment another cut, and you bleed not in red, but in willpower, in resolve, in every fragile strand of resistance until you are hollowed out, and yet somehow still alive, which feels less like survival and more like punishment. As if the dungeon does not simply wish to end you, but to stretch you, to test the farthest limit of endurance until you finally snap, and you realize this is its true cruelty, not the chains, not the hunger, not even the cold stone floor, but the waiting, the stretching of seconds into eternities, the knowing that there will be no rescue, no reprieve, no release, that death itself is not the terror but the waiting for death, the endless anticipation, and your thoughts, which once raced, now crawl, slowed by hunger, by thirst, by the ache. That has become your constant companion, but even in their sluggishness they return again and again to the same bitter circle, that you would not last, that no one ever does, that even if some small miracle allowed you to stumble free of these walls, you would never truly leave, because the dungeon marks its prisoners, etches itself into their marrow, so that even sunlight would feel like stone, even open air would taste like chains, and freedom would never be freedom again, only another kind of cell. And with this thought, a weariness deeper than flesh settles into you, as though your very soul were made of lead, and the walls, damp and rough, press in closer, or perhaps it is only your perception narrowing, your senses dimming, as exhaustion claws at the edges of your mind, and you do not even know if you drift into sleep or simply into something darker. But the dreams, if they are dreams, are no gentler than waking, filled with shadows that move like guards and whispers that carry the names of the dead, and you thrash in them, though your body has no strength to thrash. And when you open your eyes again, the dark is unchanged, and you realize the dungeon has stolen even the line between waking and dreaming. leaving you adrift in a place where both are punishments and neither brings relief. And you think, dimly, that this is eternity, not flames, not pitchforks, not gods or devils, but this unending cycle of pain and silence and waiting. And you understand with final clarity that you would not last because no one could, because to last would mean to outlast eternity itself, and nothing mortal can do that, nothing but tremble with fatigue that sleep will not mend. You realize that there is no difference between resisting and submitting, because either way the dungeon feeds, and either way you rot, and either way your story ends not with a scream or a defiance, but with the slow erasure of the self, layer by layer, until not even memory clings. And what terrifies you most is not that you will be forgotten by the world above, but that you were already forgotten here. Forgotten by yourself, forgotten by the fragile human you once were. Until only this remains: stone, silence, hunger, and the certainty that the dungeon always wins. Not by breaking you quickly, but by making you linger long enough to witness the breaking in real time, to feel yourself come apart inch by inch, thought by thought, until, at last, you no longer remember what it was you were afraid to lose in the first place. Only that it is gone, 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 and the dungeon remains. You do not rise anymore, not because you are chained or bound by anything visible, but because the idea of standing has grown absurd, a memory that belongs to someone else. Perhaps a younger self who still thought that muscles obeyed will, that bones bent under choice, that the body was more than just a collapsing husk left to stew in damp air. And you realize, with something close to wonder, that the dungeon has not struck you, has not whipped or beaten you, has not torn flesh from your frame, and yet here you rot as surely as if it had carved into you, because it knows patience better than pain, and patience is cruelty refined into art, the kind of cruelty that does not need violence, because time itself does the cutting, hour by hour slicing little pieces of you away, until you are a patchwork of emptiness sewn together with hunger. And perhaps that is what makes you laugh in your throat, a cracked, rusted laugh that dies before it reaches the air, for the dungeon does not permit laughter. Not because it forbids it, but because it makes it irrelevant, absurd. Like trying to sing in the middle of a flood, with water already climbing down your throat. And so you do not laugh again, not even inside yourself, because there is no inside. Anymore, no outside either, only stone pressing, 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 until you cannot tell if you are inside a cell or inside your own coffin. And yet the strange truth is that death will not come, not yet. As though the dungeon itself measures your heartbeat and throttles it back from the edge, forcing you to linger in a state between collapse and endurance. Not living, not dying, only stretching into a long unraveling that has no end. And you wonder if perhaps this is what forever actually means. Not fire, not brimstone, not demons with pitchforks or angels with trumpets, but this, a room that does not change, air that does not warm, stone that does not soften, a body that weakens but refuses to end, and a mind that erodes grain by grain until you no longer know if you are thinking or if the dungeon is thinking. For you, feeding words into your skull like dripping water until the words become yours, until your voice becomes indistinguishable from its silence, and you wonder if that is how it wins, not by killing but by rewriting, replacing you with itself, so that in the end there is only dungeon, 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 repeating like a chant carved into the walls, echoing inside a skull that no longer remembers what it was to be human, and yet you are still aware enough to hate it, to curse it, though even your curses sound pitiful. For how do you curse something that is not alive? How do you rage at a stone that has stood for centuries unmoved by screams? How do you pray when there is no God here but decay? No altar but damp floor, no congregation but rats that slink by, their eyes glinting in darkness like reminders that life elsewhere still feeds, still grows, still thrives on what you drop, and you envy them, you envy their scuttling freedom, their small victories, their ability to bite, to gnaw, to consume, while you cannot even swallow without pain. And when you dream of escape, it is no longer a dream of walking into sunlight, but of being small enough to crawl through cracks, to shrink into some tiny life that the dungeon cannot notice. And yet you are not small. You are clumsy with your own weight, trapped in the same frame that was once your pride and is now your tomb. And so you sit, you curl, you rot, while time coils around you like smoke, suffocating but without substance, choking without touch. And the strangest part is that somewhere, faintly, you begin to love it, not in joy, not in relief, but in the way captives sometimes love their chains, because chains are certainty, chains are stable. And the dungeon, at least, is honest in its hatred, honest in its indifference. And you realize you fear more the world outside than the stone around you, for outside there might be light too bright, faces too curious, voices too demanding, and here, at least, there is no demand, no face, no judgment, only the slow sinking into nothing. And part of you, traitorous part, whispers that maybe this is easier. Maybe it is better to stay twofold into the stone, to accept that forever is not punishment, but permanence. To let yourself become part of the dungeon so you no longer have to fight it, no longer have to breathe against it. And though another part of you resists, weakly muttering of sunlight and air and water, the whisper is louder, and perhaps that is what surrender looks like. Not dramatic collapse, not defiance, but a slow, tired nod, an unspoken agreement that you will let the dungeon keep you, because nothing else ever will. And though the thought terrifies you, it also soothes, a lullaby of stone that says you are safe now, not safe as in protected, but safe as entrapped beyond saving, safe as in certain. And certainty is the only comfort left. And so your eyes burn, your chest aches, your skin bruises where you have not moved. But your mind sways on that edge of surrender, back and forth, like a pendulum that has long forgotten what it was meant to measure. And maybe that is all eternity is. A pendulum swinging in darkness, never striking, never stopping, only moving, only repeating, while you wait and wait and wait until waiting itself is the only identity left, until you are no longer a prisoner but the act of imprisonment itself, a verb, a process, a cycle, a whisper in the dungeon's endless breath. Your breath is no longer something you command, it is something that shudders out of you in ragged pieces, each one weaker than the last, like the dungeon itself is counting down the moments left in you. And as you lie twisted against the stone, pressed into its cold embrace, the knowledge grows that what remains is not survival, but the long unraveling of what survival once meant. And this unraveling takes its time, cruelly, methodically, turning your thoughts into frayed ropes and your body into brittle clay. You remember once that a body was something you could trust, that legs held you, arms carried, eyes opened to light. But here those memories seem as far away as the sun, and the dungeon smothers them until you can almost doubt they were ever true at all, because what good is remembering warmth when every inch of you is ice? What good is remembering motion when the stones beneath you have swallowed every strength your muscles once contained? What good is imagining freedom when the Ceiling presses so low and the walls so near that freedom becomes a dream you can't even recall the shape of anymore. The dungeon knows this. It always has. That memory itself is a weapon it strips away, so you cannot tell if it is dawn or dusk, if you slept last night or last year, if you screamed a moment ago or in another lifetime. All the while, the silence teaches you that time does not move forward here, but folds in on itself, turning circles, dragging you with it, and you cannot step off, cannot stop the spin. You are lashed to it until the very core of you frays apart. The drip of water from some unseen crack becomes the only heartbeat left, and even it begins to feel like mockery. Because at least the water still falls, still moves, while you remain in place. A figure sculpted from exhaustion and despair, sinking slowly into the damp earth beneath. Hunger gnaws but no longer burns. Thirst scratches but no longer screams. Pain itself dulls into something worse than pain, a nothingness that stretches and stretches until you forget what sharpness ever felt like. Until you almost wish the rats would return, the lash would fall, the torturer's hand would strike. Anything to remind you that sensation exists at all. But the dungeon is clever, cleverer than any tormentor. It does not always need whips or chains. Sometimes it only needs the endless patience of its stones, the way darkness wraps tighter than ropes, the way silence burrows deeper than screams, the way nothing becomes everything until your mind eats itself, trying to make meaning where there is none. You trace cracks in the wall with your gaze, tiny lines that spider through the stone, and for a heartbeat they feel like maps, like roads leading somewhere else, and you almost convince yourself if you could only step into them you would be carried away, but then you blink, and they are only cracks again, indifferent, unchanging, laughing in their stillness at your desperate hope. You mouth words you cannot hear, prayers, curses, names you half remember, all dissolving in the stale air before they reach anything beyond these walls. And you realize how strange it is to speak when no ear listens, how hollow sound becomes when it touches nothing but stone, and so you stop, because even your voice feels wasted here. Instead, you listen, you wait. And in that waiting, the dungeon teaches you its final lesson, that to be forgotten is not sudden but slow, an erosion, a wearing away of edges until the stone, nothing but the dungeon, and so you curl tighter, smaller, as though folding in on yourself might make you invisible, might make you vanish, but it does not, and the stone is no softer, and the air no warmer, and the dungeon eternal and unblinking waits and waits and waits. The dungeon does not relent. It does not tire. It does not compromise. It only waits, and in that waiting it erodes everything you are. Grain by grain, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, until what remains of you is no longer a self, but only a shadow tethered loosely to bone and skin. And even that tether frays with time, because here time is not a line, but a loop, a suffocating circle that drags you through the same moments again and again, until you cannot tell whether you have lived a minute or a century, whether the stone beneath you has always been cold, or whether you once knew warmth but have forgotten. And as the hours stretch and bleed, you come to realize that forgetting is its own form of death, slow, merciless, efficient, because it strips you of anchors, steals from you even the knowledge of what you once were, until you are nothing but presence without memory, existence without meaning, a hollow vessel echoing with pain, fear, and silence, and still the dungeon presses on, and still you do not last, because you cannot last. No one can, not in the way you dreamed when you first imagined endurance. not in the way you once believed human spirit might triumph. Because spirit here is a candle beneath a tide, a whisper drowned in thunder. And though you tell yourself stories in the dark, whispering scraps of memory about fields, about sky, about voices that once called your name, the dungeon answers with stone, with water dripping endlessly, with chains clinking faintly in places you cannot see, reminding you that you are not the first, you are not alone, and yet you are entirely alone, because every prisoner is buried in their own silence, every cry swallowed, every fate sealed, and the dungeon feeds on that truth, fattening itself on despair until even your stories become hollow, until even your whispers sound foreign to your own ears, and you start to wonder if perhaps they were never real, if perhaps the dungeon invented them only to crush them. And the longer you linger, the more you realize the only real thing is this moment, this stone, this breath, this ache, and that realization itself is a chain, tightening round your chest, binding you tighter than iron. Because once you understand that nothing exists beyond the dungeon, there is no escape even in thought, no flight even in dream, and your mind, once wild and restless, curls in on itself, shrinking, whimpering, breaking, until it is no larger than the cell it inhabits, and then smaller still. Because the dungeon is not content with your body, or your memory, or your hope. It wants everything, and in the end it takes everything. And though you fight in small ways, scratching at the stone, counting drips, pressing your teeth into your lip until blood stings your tongue, those battles are not victories, but gestures. And gestures are only delays, not salvation. And the dungeon knows this. It has always known this. It has had centuries to learn the patterns of human resistance, and it has crushed every one of them, and it will crush yours. And as you lie in that dark, your ribs aching, your knees burning, your skin crawling with the phantom scurry of vermin that may or may not be real, you understand that your story was written long before you arrived, written in the dust, written in the bones of those who came before, written in the silence that now swallows you whole. And in that silence the truth returns, sharper and heavier than before. You would not last, not today, not tomorrow, not ever, because the dungeon always wins, and in the end you are nothing but proof of that eternal truth. And though your heart still beats, though your lungs still drag in the sour air, though your eyes still strain at the darkness, you know you have already been claimed, already folded into the dungeon's endless ledger of souls. And whether your body collapses now, or in a day, or in a week, makes no difference. Because survival here is not survival. It is only delay, and delay is no triumph. Delay is only another form of losing, stretched thinner. And so you lie still, you breathe shallow, you wait, and the dungeon waits with you, patient, eternal, victorious. The dungeon, if you listen closely enough, speaks, though never in words you might recognize, never in any tongue you once thought human ears could decipher, but in the creak of ancient timbers rotting somewhere beyond the wall, in the drip of water as it strikes the stone with the same steady cadence of a clock meant to mock you, in the scraping echo of rats that scurry through cracks unseen, reminding you that something else still feeds and moves and thrives while you rot, and in the whispering sigh of your own breath rebounding against damp rock until it sounds no longer yours, but another's, an intruder in your lungs. And as you dwell in that unending resonance, you begin to feel that the dungeon has been alive long before you entered it and will remain alive long after. A vast beast with stone ribs and earthbound veins, breathing through its cracks and sighing through its leaks, content to devour each prisoner, not in haste, but in eternity, savoring the collapse of their bodies and the ruin of their thoughts. And this realization grows heavier the longer you are here, until the weight of it presses as surely upon your chest as the chains at your wrists, and you begin to crumble, not because you cannot endure pain, but because endurance itself becomes meaningless when measured against a backdrop that never ends. A cycle without dawn, without reprieve, without even the promise of final collapse. For the dungeon teaches you slowly that even death is not an escape, that even when flesh rots and bone cracks, memory lingers here, caught in the stagnant air, suspended in the dripping water, so that every shudder, every prayer, every scream of every soul who ever lay upon these stones continues to murmur in the silence, unseen yet undeniable, brushing against your mind like cobwebs that you cannot sweep away. And you come to understand that this place is not only a prison, but an archive of agony, a cathedral of suffering, a monument built not of brick and mortar, but of despair layered century upon century until the very air is thick with it, choking, cloying, wrapping itself around you until you breathe not air but history, and not the kind of history recorded in scrolls or carved on monuments, but history written in flesh, in cries, in the endless rasp of chains against stone. And as this awareness settles upon you, you find yourself shivering not only at the cold, but at the knowledge that you have joined this archive, that already the dungeon has written you into itself, already taken the measure of your body, your mind, your weaknesses, already prepared a place for you among its collection of shadows, and there is nothing you can do to erase yourself, no. Scratch you carve into the stone will outlast its patience. No cry you force from your throat will echo louder than the centuries of cries that have already been absorbed. And this truth gnaws at you until even hope becomes absurd. A joke you can no longer repeat without tasting bitterness, and you begin to shrink, not in body at first, but in self, your thoughts curling tighter and tighter, no longer daring to wander beyond the walls, no longer daring to dream of escape, until one day you realize you have not thought of the outside for what may have been hours or may have been weeks, and the faces you once loved blur, their features dissolve, their names slip like dust between your fingers, and you clutch at them, desperate, but the dungeon shakes them loose, and soon all that remains is the present, the ache, the drip, the cold, the chain, and the endless waiting, which is not waiting at all, because waiting requires an end, and here there is none, only continuation, only prolonging. And in this prolonging you finally see what the dungeon wanted all along, not your body, not your death, but your surrender, the quiet collapse of your mind until you no longer resist, until you no longer struggle, until you become as silent, as still, as unchanging as the stone itself, and in that moment you feel a flicker of horror, for you realize you are perilously close. You realize you are becoming what the dungeon has shaped countless others into before you. An echo of silence, a hollow husk that lingers long after flesh is gone, and though some desperate fragment of yourself claws to resist, whispering that you must fight, that you must remember, that you must keep hold of who you were, that fragment grows weaker with each passing drip, with each gnaw of hunger, with each crawl of vermin across your skin, until its voice is no louder than the faintest sigh, icily drowned, and when it finally breaks, when even that whisper is lost, you will belong entirely to the dungeon, not as a living prisoner, not as a corpse, but as a shadow woven into its eternal fabric, part of its voice, part of its weight, part of its endless hunger. And perhaps then you will understand the final truth. The truth that all who came before you must have learned in their last lucid moments. You never truly entered the dungeon. You were always in it, from the moment you were born, from the moment you first drew breath. Life itself was only the corridor that led here, and now that corridor has closed. There is nowhere left to go, and the only journey remaining is the slow, inevitable sinking into silence, until you are gone, and yet not gone, erased, and yet inscribed, broken, and yet preserved. In the only way the dungeon ever allows. The dungeon does not end when the body ends. It seeps past the marrow and lingers in the hollow spaces where thought used to live. It teaches you that endings are only illusions dressed up in silence. That when breath rattles out for the last time, the stone still presses in, the iron still bites the skin, the cold still lingers in a place that no longer has flesh to feel it. And in this way, the dungeon wins twice, once by grinding you down in life, and again by refusing to release you in death. For its memory gnaws at you, even when memory should have no meaning, and you realize that not even death is escape, only another turning of the key in a lock you never saw. The dungeon always wins because it was never about you, never about the strength of your legs or the sharpness of your mind, never about how loudly you cried or how quietly you endured. It was about the permanence of stone, the endurance of silence, the patience of dark, all things you could never rival, and so you lie in it, or rather the you that was lies in it. And the stone does not change. It simply accepts, as it has accepted every figure that stumbled through its gates, every breath that coughed dust, every prayer that echoed without answer, every scream that faded into quiet, every body that dissolved into ash or bones or dust that looks no different from the dust already layered there long before you. And this truth swallows you whole. This truth whispers that the dungeon is not a place but a law older than kings, older than crowns, older than the swords that filled its cells, a law that says flesh is weak and stone does not care, a law that says shadow always waits and silence always outlasts, a law you were born into but never noticed until the door closed and the air thickened and you felt time slow into eternity. And now you know why you would not last, why no one ever lasts, why the dungeon does not need to try, because survival was never an option, only the illusion of it stretched out minute by miserable minute, until you were nothing but another layer of forgotten proof, another whisper in the dark, reminding anyone unlucky enough to follow that escape is a myth, that endurance is a lie, that the dungeon always wins. Not today, not tomorrow, but always. And so the dungeon holds you even in this unraveling, even in this dissolution where you are no longer skin and thought, but a smear of memory clinging to the cracks of the stone. And the dark curls tighter, whispering in that voice that is not quite sound but more like the weight of time pressing on what remains of you, reminding you again and again that you would not last, that no one ever does, that all roads lead here. In the end, whether by chains or hunger or silence itself, for the dungeon does not need to move to conquer. It only waits, patient as the centuries, indifferent as the stars. And in its waiting it wears everything down, every hope, every bone, every fleeting dream of escape, until even the idea of resistance seems absurd, until even the notion of a world beyond these walls feels like a childish lie told to make the final collapse easier, and you wonder if perhaps there never was a world outside. Perhaps the dungeon is all that ever was. And everything else, the sun, the fields, the voices of people you once thought you loved, were only shadows painted on the wall, a cruel play staged by the mind to delay the inevitable. And here, stripped of all but the truth, you see it clearly. The dungeon is eternal, you are not. And that difference is the only story that ever mattered, the only story that ever will. And yet the dungeon is generous in its cruelty. It does not simply erase you, it lets you linger, lets you taste the slow rot of self, lets you feel time stretch until it loses meaning, lets you learn the lesson carved into every stone here. The lesson that endurance is not survival, endurance is only a slower death, a drawn-out proof that the dungeon can take everything from you and still demand more, until even the memory of resistance feels like betrayal, until even the thought of light feels like an insult, until all that is left is the dungeon itself wearing your outline, a hollow echo that sounds like you but is not you, a presence that knows only waiting, only silence, only the slow grinding of eternity. And so, you remain, not alive, not gone, only claimed, a relic the stone keeps without caring, proof that you would not last, not today, not tomorrow, not ever, because the dungeon always wins, and it will go on winning long after your dust has forgotten its own name. Long after the idea of you has drifted into the cracks where countless others have already been swallowed, long after even memory itself surrenders, for the dungeon is forever, and you are not. And that is the end written before you ever began. The dungeon does not celebrate its victories, because, for it, there is no such thing as victory, only the continuation of what has always been. An endless, consuming silence that feeds not on triumph, but on inevitability, and you, folded into its stillness, realize that even the thought of defiance was only ever permitted so it could be broken more cleanly, more thoroughly, and so here you are, stripped not just of flesh and hope, but of the illusion that there could be an end to this. For the dungeon does not end, it does not sleep. It does not weaken, it only waits, and waiting is its only weapon, yet the sharpest of all. Sharper than chains, sharper than blades, sharper than any torment devised by hands that die and forget. For waiting turns every breath into confession, every heartbeat into surrender, and you feel how the air itself presses down on you, not as air, but as centuries stacked one on another, each second heavier than the last. And you realize the weight has no ceiling. It will grow and grow until there is no self left to bear it. Only the dungeon carrying itself forward, and you are already dissolving into that endlessness, already blurring, already less than even the faint shadow that once clung to the stone, and yet the dungeon holds you, keeps you hovering just on the line where existence is agony and non-existence is forbidden. A balance only eternity can maintain, and in that balance you finally understand what forever means. Not beauty, not light, not any promise whispered by poets or priests, but this, stone unyielding, air stagnant, silence louder than thought, the certainty that nothing changes, and that nothing changing is itself the only change, and you are caught in it, unraveling and remade into nothing. Still aware but not awake, still present but not alive, and the dungeon teaches you with every fraction of a second that this is not punishment, not cruelty, not even malice, but truth. The purest truth that existence is fragile, temporary, already lost the moment it begins. And the dungeon is simply the mirror that shows this truth without flinching, without comfort, without lies, and you cannot look away because there is no way to look toward. There is only this, the dark, the stone, the silence, the forever of being undone. And in that forever you see yourself not as victim but as dust caught in a tide, dust that imagines it could resist but never does. dust that imagines it could last but never will, and in that seeing you almost laugh, though there is no voice left to laugh with, almost weep, though there are no eyes left to weep from, almost pray, though there are no gods left to hear. And even those almosts crumble, because the dungeon does not deal in almost, it only deals in what is, and what is this. You are here. You are gone. You are nothing. You are the dungeon's echo, its proof, its continuation. And that is all you will ever be, all you can ever be, because the dungeon always wins. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, but always, and you, at last, are nothing more than the silence that proves it. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, but always. And you, at last, are nothing more than the silence that proves it. And in that silence, the dungeon reshapes you again. The slow crawl of time gnawing at whatever thin threads of self you still cling to, so that the memory of daylight is no longer light, but only a faded echo you cannot grasp. And the memory of warmth is no longer warmth, but only a cruel imagining, a trick your mind plays before tearing it away, leaving you raw and empty. And the memory of voices, of laughter, of footsteps in streets, of market cries and haggling, of children chasing one another through mud and dust, all become phantoms dissolving before you can touch them. And so your body rots where it rests, your ribs stiff from pressing against stone, your knees swollen, your back burning with an ache that has no end. And you wonder if the bones beneath your skin belong to you or to the dungeon, for it seems the dungeon claims them, shaping them as it shaped every prisoner before you, grinding them down, hollowing them out, keeping what it wants and discarding what it doesn't. For here you are not master of yourself, but merely a guest who will never leave, a shadow who is no longer alive, yet not yet dead, suspended in that cruel between place, where the drip of water becomes your heartbeat and the rattle of chains becomes your lullaby, and when your mind, desperate to survive, begins to wander, you chase illusions like a starving dog chasing scraps. You imagine bread so stale it cuts your gums, but you would devour it. You imagine broth so thin it is little, more than colored water, but you would drink it. You imagine the sharpness of a winter wind on your face, and even that would be mercy compared to the suffocating air here, and yet the dungeon allows none of it. It keeps you bound to the now, to the stone, to the wet, to the dark. And the dark whispers truths you wish you did not hear, truths that unravel you, that every prisoner before you thought themselves stronger, thought themselves more enduring, thought perhaps they could last, but none did. Because lasting here is not about will, but about surrender. And even surrender is not enough, for the dungeon devours surrender until nothing remains but a husk that once believed in survival. And when you try to imagine the passage of time, you cannot, for days are no longer days, hours are no longer hours, minutes are no longer minutes, but all collapse into one endless stretch of torment, and you lose the thread. You cannot remember if you have been here a week or a year, and then you realize it doesn't matter, because the dungeon erases calendars as easily as it erases names, and soon your name slips from you as well, your tongue forgetting the taste of it, your lips no longer remembering how to form it, until you are nameless, faceless, just another shadow among countless shadows, just another silence in a corridor of silences. And even the thought of rescue grows laughable, for who would come? And even if someone came, would you be yourself anymore, or just a ghost that cannot follow them back into the sun? And so the dungeon teaches you its final lesson, that survival is not measured in breaths or heartbeats, but in the surrender of self. And since you have surrendered, since you have been consumed, since you are no longer you, the dungeon has won, as it always wins, as it will always win. And you know at last that the silence that proves it is not only your silence, but the silence of everyone who ever curled against these stones. And that silence will go on long after your bones have cracked into dust, long after even the memory of you has been lost, because the dungeon does not need memory. It needs only silence, and you, broken, nameless, and gone, are that silence given form. And so the silence that swallows you becomes not an end but a continuation. For in its depths you begin to sense shapes and currents that are not your own thoughts, as though the dungeon itself breathes through you, uses your lungs as its bellows, your eyes as its blind sockets, your flesh as its crumbling manuscript, writing upon you the same story it has written upon countless others, the story of erasure and of surrender, and you feel yourself drifting, as though your body is a husk tethered to stone, while your mind floats outward, upward, or perhaps downward. It is hard to tell directions here, because in the dark there is no up, no down, only the endless middle, the eternal suspension, and in that middle you see flickers, not visions but impressions, as though the dungeon lends you fragments from those who came before, the way a sea returns shells and bones to the shore, and you catch glimpses of faces you do not recognize, of voices muttering in tongues you cannot name, of hands clawing against walls that crumble like sand, of footsteps dragging in corridors that stretch on without end, and you realize with a clarity both terrible and serene that the dungeon is a continuum, a single body with countless mouths, countless eyes, countless histories folded into its stone, and you are simply one more fold, one more echo, one more smudge upon its endless ledger. And perhaps that is why the silence feels so vast, because it is not yours alone but the layered silence of centuries of suffering, pressed together into a blackness so thick it hums like a sound below hearing, a vibration that rattles the marrow of your bones, and the more you sense it, the more it consumes you, until you no longer try to resist. For resistance feels absurd, like trying to hold back an ocean with a single cupped hand, and so you open yourself to it, let it pour through you, and in that pouring you feel the strange liberation of release, the dissolution of boundaries you once called identity, the evaporation of the word I, and yet this liberation is no salvation. For salvation suggests rescue, and here there is none, only absorption. The folding of your small story into the vast unbroken story of the dungeon, and as you yield, you feel time uncoil around you, the false rope of days and nights snapping free, and you drift into what could be eternity or nothingness or both at once, and there you wander among shadows that are not shadows but residues, spectral imprints of those who once inhabited the dungeon's belly, men and women and children whose voices long ago fell silent. Yet in this deep current you hear them faintly, a choir without words, a murmur of loss that is at once endless lament and endless acceptance, and you recognize yourself among them, your silence joining theirs, until you are no longer distinguishable. And though this should terrify you, it does not, for terror requires a self to feel it, and you no longer possess a self in the way you once did. You are fragment, you are dust, you are echo, and still the dungeon feeds, gnawing even at the ghost of you, polishing it into smooth anonymity. And you understand now that this is not punishment nor cruelty in the sense mortals use the word, but rather function, like stone eroding under, water like wood consumed by flame, like bones whitening under the sun. And the dungeon is merely the element through which you pass, the crucible that breaks you into your smallest parts and disperses you, scattering you into the eternal silence. And in that scattering, perhaps there is a strange equality, for kings and beggars are indistinguishable here. Voices of generals collapse into the same hush as voices of thieves. And the dungeon does not honor nor scorn either. It merely consumes, indifferent, eternal, absolute. And as this realization sinks into what remains of you, you sense the futility of memory itself. For to remember requires distinction, and distinction is precisely what is undone here. And so memories shatter like brittle glass, not erased but absorbed, dissolved into the general mass, the great tide of silence that needs no names nor faces. And you, who once carried so many names and faces within you, now feel lighter, emptier, freer, though freedom here is not life, but dissolution. And dissolution is the final truth. And as you drift deeper into it, you begin to wonder if perhaps this silence is what lies beyond every life, dungeon or not, that the walls and chains and shadows are but a concentrated mirror of what awaits all souls. That beyond the noise of breath and heartbeat there is only this vast stillness, this quiet swallowing, this unbroken middle that has no beginning and no end. And though you cannot answer, you cannot test the thought. You carry it as long as carrying is possible, until even thoughts themselves unravel, until the words that once threaded meaning through your mind fall silent too, and you become only silence. And the dungeon, patient and unyielding, continues, as it always has, as it always will, indifferent to the parade of flesh that feeds it, waiting not for tomorrow, not forever, but always. You are silence, but silence itself is not the end, for the dungeon does not allow even silence to remain pure. It twists it, stretches it, cracks it with the dripping of unseen water, the groaning of stone under its own weight, the scurrying of rats that know you better than you know yourself, for they have watched you decay day by day, hour by hour. And even now, as you lie half unmade, they wait with patience sharper than blades, because they know you are food, warmth, softness, and soon, when the stillness becomes too heavy, they will come close, closer, closer still, their whiskers brushing your skin as though to remind you that you are no longer feared, no longer human, only another rotting story in a place already overflowing with them. And in that moment, when the tickle of fur across your hand or cheek jolts you into half-life again, you realize that the dungeon has not let you go, not even when you thought the end had already arrived, because the end never arrives here. It only reshapes itself into endless rehearsals of endings that never quite resolve, and so you are caught between breaths, between shadows, between the possibility of nothingness and the cruelty of continuation, drifting in a half-dream that cannot be woken from. And in that dream you see what was once outside. You see light as memory, warmth as ghost, laughter as a sound so alien it could be the voice of another species, and you almost laugh yourself, though no air leaves your throat. Because the idea of laughter here is a crime, a parody, a sound that would be murdered before it could ever echo, yet in your skull it plays, tinny, fragile, and it hurts more than any lash or iron could, for memory is sharper than pain, and pain at least anchors you, but memory unmoors you until you are nothing but a hollow shell filled with echoes that no one asked for, and the dungeon, merciful in its way, shows you the bones beneath you again, the ones you pretended not to feel when you first collapsed here, the ones whose shapes dug into your ribs, your hip, your skull, and though they never moved, they feel closer now, as though they creep toward you, as though they too hunger for the warmth of a body not yet fully undone. And perhaps they do. Perhaps the bones remember what it was to be clothed in flesh. Perhaps they envy you, or perhaps they are simply mirrors, the dungeon leaves scattered about. Reminders that you too are becoming them. That their hollow sockets are your future eyes. Their brittle teeth your future smile. Their silence your final prayer. And as you drift closer to that truth, you find that even breath becomes a negotiation. That to inhale is to steal something. The dungeon did not grant you that to exhale is to confess your theft. And soon even that game exhausts you. So you lie still and let the damp chew its way into you. And the damp is thorough. It softens your nails until they peel away like bark. It puckers your skin into grey maps of rivers and valleys that no cartographer will ever chart. It seeps into your marrow until your bones are less you than sponge. Until they could snap under the weight of a thought. And all the while the dungeon whispers without sound, a sermon of rot, a gospel of patience, a promise that nothing you were matters now, nothing you dreamed, nothing you loved, nothing you hated, because all of it was always destined to be stripped, to be emptied, to be left here. And so you finally believe, you finally understand. Though the understanding does not save you, it only deepens the wound, for knowledge has no teeth. And when the rat finally does bite, sinking needle teeth into the corner of your foot, you do not flinch, you do not scream, you simply acknowledge it as the next chapter. And in that submission the dungeon rejoices, though it has no need to gloat, because victory here is older than kingdoms, older than crowns, older even than the stones themselves, and you are merely another line written into the script of its eternity. Another sigh swallowed, another pulse extinguished. And though you try to imagine resistance, though you try to picture chains breaking, torches flaring, sunlight tearing down walls, your mind is too soft now, too tired, too caved in on itself, and the pictures blur until they are nothing but smears, until the only image that remains is of a mouth that keeps swallowing, 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 and you know it is the dungeon's mouth, though it wears no lips, no tongue, no throat, only the endless hunger of time itself, and into that hunger you fall, and you keep falling, for there is no bottom, no floor to catch you, only the memory of stone that once bruised your back, and even that fades, and then all that is left is you, or what is left of you, stretched thin across the void, unraveling like thread, and still the dungeon waits, waits with the patience of the dead, waits with the patience of things that cannot end, waits until you understand, finally, deeply, cruelly, that you would not last, not today, not tomorrow, not ever, not even in memory. Because even memory rots here, and even silence breaks, and even the truth itself becomes dust. And still the dungeon remains, unblinking, unbroken, undefeated, eternal, and you, nothing more than its echo. You have walked through every shadowed corner of this dungeon now, endured the long cold nights, the silence broken only by the drip of unseen water, the clatter of rats, the echo of chains, and the soft rasp of your own shallow breathing, and you understand what so many before you never truly accepted until the end, that the dungeon is not simply stone and darkness, but a truth, a test, and a reminder of how little flesh and will mean against eternity. You have clawed at the walls, pressed your cheek against damp stone as if it might offer comfort, closed your eyes to imagine escape, only to awaken to the same suffocating air. And in each moment you learned what it means to be small, breakable, forgotten, until at last there is no resistance left, only the surrender to the lesson carved into your body and mind alike that you would not last here. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, because no one ever has. Because the dungeon does not yield, because the silence swallows every plea, every scream, every heartbeat, until even your memory is gone, and what remains is nothing but the dungeon itself, unchanged, unbroken, patient as always, waiting for the next soul who believes they are stronger, braver, more enduring, only to discover the same truth that you now carry. And yet, as this story closes, as the final chains fade into the distance and the last flicker of torchlight dies, there is something left to take with you beyond the dungeon's stone jaws, a reminder that history is not built only on kings and heroes, but on the forgotten, the imprisoned, the countless men and women who vanished into places like these, whose stories were never told, whose names are dust, and in telling their silence we honor them. Perhaps, as you leave this tale behind and step back into the warmth of your own room, the comfort of your own bed, you feel the weight of perspective settle quietly on your shoulders, and you realize that the true gift of wandering the dungeon is not in surviving it, but in knowing you never could, in recognizing the fragile miracle of your own freedom, your own breath, your own ordinary life. And so, if you carry anything from this long night of stone and shadow, let it be this: that comfort is rare, that safety is fragile, that light is a treasure you must never take for granted, because there are places in the world past and present where none of those exist, where men and women sit in darkness even now, waiting for dawns that never come. So if you are listening still, I invite you to hold on to that awareness, to cherish it, and perhaps to join me again on another journey into history's forgotten corners, where suffering, resilience, and quiet humanity leave their marks in ways we can still feel centuries later. And if you found yourself drawn into this dungeon, if you felt its chill, its silence, its merciless truth, then I ask you to share this story, to subscribe if you wish for more nights like this, to leave behind a word or thought in the darkness, so I know you walked here too, and together we will keep opening the doors of history that were never meant to be opened, peering into the places where no one lasts, but where stories still wait to be told. And for now, as the final stone closes, as the chains fall silent, and as the dungeon claims its last echo, I will let the shadows have the rest, and I will leave you in peace, because the dungeon always wins. But tonight, you do not have to fight it any longer. You may rest, you may breathe, you may close your eyes knowing you are safe, because the story is over, and so, good night.